So when Breath of the Wild came out, I wasn't quite as in love with it as everyone else was. It was great, don't get me wrong, but to me, it just wasn't the best game ever like most people seem to worship it as. It had some pretty distinctive flaws, and while I liked it, just wasn't all that special to me. But, I mean, aside from the whole video I did about that and expectations and stuff, it's not really surprising. I'm not that into open world games. Most of the time, though not in Breath of the Wild's case, they kind of feel like empty gimmicks. And being someone who's used to immersive sims like Deus Ex, the mechanical experimentation in Breath of the Wild was never that impressive to me. But now we have a sequel. I was a little skeptical about Tears of the Kingdom at first because, as I said, I was never the biggest fan of Breath of the Wild, but having played it, it honestly feels like the game that fans described when they gushed about how good Breath of the Wild was. It really is that good. So let's get into it with the mechanics. First off, let's be honest, the abilities in the first Breath of the Wild weren't actually that interesting. Yeah, heretical, I know, but hear me out. While you could have a bit of fun with these abilities with enough creativity, there really wasn't much to them on a straightforward application, which I think made the game a lot harder to get into. But while Tears of the Kingdom's abilities take a lot of influence from those in Breath of the Wild, they are so much better. They're much more straightforwardly and regularly useful, while having plenty of room for creative application still, probably exceeding what you could do in Breath of the Wild. Ultra Hand is just Magnesis turned up to 12. You can now move anything you want with it, and you can stick things together either to do weird things or to form contraptions. And because you can acquire capsules to deploy various objects at will, this isn't limited to just where the developers want you to use it. Fuse I go into a lot more later on, but it not only helps with weapon supplies, but also gives new utility to materials in your inventory and for items in the environment. These let you turn limited resources into many different creative solutions to problems. Ascend fundamentally changes how you navigate the world. Scaling areas is much easier. It can often be used as a quick way out of certain caves, and it can be interesting to experiment with where you can get to by diving up with it. And lastly, there's the recall ability. It's probably the most situational one, but it still has its uses. It can help a lot with manipulating items, and you can even use it to reflect certain enemy attacks. And unlike the old time stop, the action now freezes while you aim it, making it very easy to snag items that might otherwise get away from you. As you can tell by the fact I keep emphasizing it, probably the biggest difference from Breath of the Wild is how the developers make sure to give you chances to use all of these abilities regularly. Fuse is always relevant because of how important it is to fuse things to your weapons. There are constant piles of objects meant to build with Ultra Hand. Frequent cave dives means you'll often have a chance to use Ascension, and even Recall, niche as it is frequently useful for ascending up to Sky Islands, or just grabbing an item you dropped while building with the Ultra Hand. Beyond the abilities you get, there were many other mechanical improvements as well. You can now hold and throw any material from your inventory, some of these effectively serving as grenades. These include bomb flowers that replace the old bombs. Along with fusing items to weapons or arrows, this means that these materials that once existed mostly to sell are now additional tools for you to use to interact with the world. Use a bomb flower to blow away rocks. Fuse a gem to a weapon to create a magic rod. Use a pine cone to turn a fire into an updraft. In addition, you can acquire portable versions of the various machine parts and use them to build or to fuse to make technological weapons. Cooking is made easier by the inclusion of a recipe book that lets you make dishes in large quantities with ease. Between the fuse mechanic and weapons seeming to have a bit more durability than Breath of the Wild, the woes of constantly breaking weapons are basically gone in this game. They still make you vary your tactics. Base weapons can have different special abilities, and many more valuable fusion materials are in short supplies, so weapon durability still matters. But it works way better than in the first game, and almost never becomes a frustration. In particular, because stronger enemies drop stronger materials, combat no longer feels like a waste of resources like it often did in Breath of the Wild. It feels like they perfectly kept all the value provided by the weapon durability system while removing what people hated about it. Combat itself also definitely feels better. Fury Rush in the first game felt kind of awful and slow, and that's completely fixed now. You can now headshot skeletal enemies with a bow and instantly take them out instead of having to then chase down their head like you just broke their body normally. And because it no longer feels like a waste of your resources, it's less of a bitter pill to swallow to have to fight. Although to be fair, a lot of this could just be me being more used to the gameplay, or even me getting lucky and getting 2 armor pieces that boost my attack very early on. But regardless, I cannot separate this review, if you can even call it that, from my subjective experiences, and I found the combat was better. But just as important as the game's mechanics are the world you use them in, and this is another area where Tears of the Kingdom massively improves upon its predecessor. There's so much more to explore and find. Caves and wells supplement shrines by providing other types of interesting areas to find and explore, and the depths and the sky areas greatly expand the overworld you have to explore. The world feels so much bigger, and combined with the changes to the world map, it is incredibly easy to overlook the fact that you're exploring more or less the same Hyrule as the last game. There's actually so much to the world that it causes some minor performance issues. Sometimes there's a bit of a frame rate drop, nothing too bad, and when there's a real issue, the game just pauses to load things. It usually only happens when you're changing layers and there's a lot to load, such as diving from the sky into a densely packed village, and even then it happened maybe like 5 times in the 100 hours I've spent with the game so far. Honestly, these issues are pretty minor, and I've seen much worse issues from games running on much more powerful hardware. One of the biggest additions is what amounts to sky dungeons. I always felt like Breath of the Wild's divine beasts were a little too short to really scratch that Zelda dungeon itch for me, even if their gimmicks were interesting. But the sky dungeons are much larger and more elaborate. While the dungeon proper tends to be small, about the size of a divine beast, there's a whole archipelago that leads up to each one, usually giving a good amount of combat and puzzle challenges and creative mechanics in a more constrained environment than the openness of the rest of the game. This might honestly be one of my favorite additions in this game. Dungeons were always the highlight of classic Zelda games for me, and I'm glad to be proven right that they can coexist with the Breath of the Wild formula. You even start the game with one of these, which honestly was the perfect way to make me love this game from the start. Shrines are also back and better than ever. While at first it does seem a bit repetitive to use the exact same shrine concept that Breath of the Wild did, it actually works quite well. The shrines explore a lot of the new mechanics, and they generally feel a lot better developed. A lot of them feel like they're teaching you new ways to use the myriad of systems at your disposal, something that is invaluable in a game with as many possible interactions as this. Finding a way to teach you the mechanics organically is very impressive. And of course, lastly, to circle back to mechanics, the tools you have to explore the world are more varied than they ever were. There's an elixir and armor effect that can counter rain, which previously could stop you playing the game entirely. Most of the new abilities discussed earlier had some new way to interact with the world, and the various items you can throw have a huge variety of uses. I'm not sure I've ever felt before like a game gave me such effective and varied options for exploring the world. I feel I have more freedom of movement than Breath of the Wild, but at the same time, unlike so many games that emphasize the freedom of movement, it still feels like you have to put in the work to navigate the world. The new tools haven't taken away the achievement of getting to your destination. In conclusion, Tears of the Kingdom feels like the game that people described when they were talking about Breath of the Wild. It is a perfect sequel, one that clearly understands what its predecessor did right and what it did wrong, and endeavors to refine the game. Or maybe I just needed enough time with the games for them to click, and the time I spent with the first game was enough for that to happen with this game. Could be that too, honestly. I could criticize it for how some elements feel repetitive, but honestly that feels like it would be disingenuous here. It's not trying to be a completely radically different game. It's trying to be the perfected version of Breath of the Wild. I feel like games should be allowed to have at least one direct sequel that doesn't have to change too much. Give them the time to make improvements and learn from criticism before having to completely reinvent the wheel again. Tears of the Kingdom is a perfect example of this. The game's goal is to be a polished version of Breath of the Wild, so trying to do something radically different would undermine that. Tears of the Kingdom is the sequel that Breath of the Wild needed and deserved. If Breath of the Wild was the must-play game that gave the Switch its start, then Tears of the Kingdom is the perfect must-play game to serve as one of the last big titles on the console. It does raise some questions, like where the series will go from here, but that's something for another video. For now, Tears of the Kingdom is a masterpiece of a game, and you should absolutely play it. If it ends up being the swan song for the Nintendo Switch, it's one beautiful piece to end out on.